I'd like to welcome everyone to the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training's virtual diplomatic lunch discussion. My name is Mark Rincon. I'm an active duty Foreign Service Officer with ADST, and I'll serve today as a moderator. As part of ADST's mission to strengthen public appreciation of American diplomacy and enrich professional knowledge by capturing, preserving, and sharing the experiences of U.S. diplomats, this series features policy experts and authors who have a connection with us. We invite you to learn more, support our efforts, and sign up to preserve your own oral history at adst.org. So as an organization, ADST is still mourning the loss and the passing of former Secretary of State George Shultz. He had a profound impact on the lives and the work of many American diplomats. So today we have a dual-theme discussion. On the one hand, we'd like to remember the legacy of George Shultz, and to help us do so, we're incredibly pleased to have with us Dr. Jim Timbie. He knew and worked very well with Shultz during his time at the State Department. In fact, he collaborated with the former Secretary of State on a book, A Hinge of History, Governance in an Emerging New World, which examines a range of issues shaping our present and future region by region. I think we'd also like to hear about Dr. Timbie's over 40-year experience with the State Department, where he served as a key player in the formulation or the implementation of virtually every important arms control and non-proliferation effort that occurred during his tenure. These include the INF, the START treaties, as well as negotiating with Russia and Iran, where he was the lead US expert in the negotiation of the Iran nuclear agreement. Some of you perhaps might be familiar with the State Department's Timbie Forum, named after him. It hosts diverse, dynamic, and sometimes provocative panels, speakers, and presentations in the hopes of generating the kinds of ideas and leaders that will help reduce the threat posed by weapons of mass destruction and other unconventional weapons. Timbie was a model diplomat, a scientist having earned his doctorate in physics from Stanford, and a public servant. He continues to be a role model for all those who aspire to join or excel in this field, and he's now at the Stanford University's Hoover Institution as the Annenberg Distinguished Visiting Fellow. I'm sure we're in for an insightful discussion, and I'd now like to invite Dr. Timbie to open the conversation, perhaps speaking to your personal experience with George Shultz, your collaboration on the book, and more about your interesting career. Dr. Timbie, over to you, please.
Okay, thank you, Mark, and I'll do my best to live up to that introduction. As you said, I retired from the State Department 5 years ago after 44 years, working mostly on nuclear negotiations, first with the Soviet Union, then Russia, then finally Iran. I didn't have a retirement plan other than to ride my bicycle a lot. And then I got an email from George Shultz inviting me to work with him at Stanford. And he and I had worked closely together when he was Secretary of State, particularly on the INF and START negotiations. So that seemed like a good idea to work again with George Shultz. I've not actually moved to California, but before the pandemic, I was in the habit of spending every third week out there. And I remember my first day at Stanford. I walked into George Shultz's office, and he told me three things. The first was, ditch the tie. This is California. We don't wear ties here. And the second thing he said was, for the first time, you can do anything you want. Up to now, you've had a boss who told you what to do, or you had an inbox that filled up every day with things to do. Now you can do whatever you like. And the third thing he said was, I have this project that might interest you. There are big transformational changes taking place. Demographics are changing. Some countries are getting older. Their workforces are shrinking. Other countries are young and growing. There's migration. Demographics is huge, and hardly anyone is paying attention. And then there's artificial intelligence. That's getting a lot of attention, but it's also causing a lot of disruption that we ought to understand that. And then there's 3D printing. And that isn't getting the attention that artificial intelligence is, but it's just as important. You can make things now near where they'll be used. And that's going to reverse globalization. And finally, there's the information revolution. and social media. People get their information in new ways and they connect in new ways. And Shultz emphasized that these transformations, these megatrends are huge. Whatever you're trying to do, whether you're trying to govern a country, govern a city, run a business or school, university, whatever it is you're trying to do, if you don't understand the impact of these transformational changes on what you're doing, you won't get it right. So I took the hint and went to work on Shultz's project. And the goal of the project is first to understand these transformational changes, their impact on our economy, on the workplace, on education, on healthcare, national security, on democracy, and also their impact on other countries, Russia, China, Africa, Latin America. And what you find when you look into these big transformations is that these changes create big opportunities, better productivity, more prosperous country, better health, better informed, better connected. But at the same time, they create big problems: workplace disruption, growing inequality, decline of traditional media, growth of fake news. So the second goal of the project is to suggest how best to capture the benefits, to seize the opportunities, and mitigate the problems. So that's what I've been doing for the last 4 years. We had a team that pursued this project, looking at the big transformations. We produced 2 books. So let me say a few words about process. State Department, always interested in process. We divided the project up into 14 topics. The impact of these transformations on the economy and education, on Russia, on China. Then, for each of these topics, we identified 3 or 4 or 5 people who really understand these issues. Some in academia, some former government, some retired military, some in think tanks. People who did not have to do a lot of research. They could just sit down and write a paper for us. So each of these people would get a letter from George Shultz outlining what the project was all about and what aspect we would like that individual to address, inviting them to write us a paper, and then come to California, where we sit down around a table. They would make a presentation followed by questions, comments, discussions. Just about everyone who received such a letter from George Shultz said, sure, I'll write you a paper, I'll come to your roundtable discussion. So over a period of about 2 years, we collected 66 papers and addressed them around 14 roundtable conferences, spending most of a day around a big circular table in a conference room at Stanford, engaging on these big issues with people who understand them. And then at the end of the day, we would move to a big auditorium for a public panel for students, faculty, interested citizens of Silicon Valley, and it was live streamed over the internet. So, and the papers are all now posted on the Hoover Institution website, along with our observations of the discussion. So at the end of the process, we had 66 papers and records of 14 roundtable discussions. And a team of 4 of us, plus George Shultz, we pulled all this together into 2 books. The second of which is called The Hinge of History, just came out in December, nominally, roughly timed to coincide with George Shultz's 100th birthday. So what have we learned about these big transformations? Well, everywhere we look, we see that changing demographics are posing big challenges. Many countries have aging populations, shrinking workforces. They face real problems maintaining their economic strength to support the elderly, educate the young. Many other countries have young and growing populations and face the problem of strengthening educational systems, particularly for women and girls, to foster reduced fertility and increase job opportunities. Migration, properly managed, can benefit both the young and growing countries and the aging countries, but migration has its own challenges. The United States is one of the very few developed countries whose workforce continues to grow thanks to migration. The only other 2 are Canada and Australia. They also are countries that are open to migration. We attract migrants from all over the world who contribute to our technical prowess and also to our economic success. By contrast, Russia and China have serious problems. They both have shrinking workforces. Russia has a hydrocarbon-based economy the size of Italy. There would not be a global presence but for its nuclear weapons. China will not see the economic growth it's enjoyed in the past. We see potential for working with these countries. Some forms of cooperation could be mutually beneficial. Turning to technology, starting with artificial intelligence, machines used to do what they were programmed to do. Now machines can be trained to learn from examination of lots and lots of data. Applications of machine learning are disrupting industries throughout the economy. For almost every job, some parts can be done better by machines. Nearly every worker is affected in some way. In manufacturing, in retail, in finance, healthcare, even computer programming. And the pace of change continues to be swift. These new technologies have great potential to make us more prosperous, more healthy, better informed, but they also raise problems. Some workers need new skills to keep up with the evolution of their jobs. Others need training for new occupations. Community colleges, in partnership with industry, have proven successful in providing the skills to support a transition from one job to the next. And this is a recurring theme in our project. The transformational changes present big opportunities and big problems, and much is going to depend on our ability to capture the benefits while mitigating the problems. Social media, a new form of communication, connect and inform people worldwide, but they spread misinformation and they pose new challenges for governance. Individuals can identify others of the same mind and link up with them to oppose initiatives, and the result is gridlock. In the words of one of our participants, and I quote here, "We can now stop anything we don't want, but we can't enable anything we need." 3D printing, other ways to produce goods near where they will be used, provide many benefits, including more choice, customized products, unique products, lower costs, reshoring of jobs. Other countries could see disruption of their economies as low-cost labor becomes less of an advantage. So these three transformational technologies, artificial intelligence, the information revolution, new manufacturing methods, they all come together to affect national security. They have enabled the development of smart, inexpensive, lethal systems that can be produced in large numbers, strike with great precision, and they threaten legacy systems. Iran demonstrated the potential of these systems in its strike on a Saudi oil facility. We may ourselves find that we are in uncharted territory in future conflicts, which are likely to involve actions in space and cyberspace, as well as the more familiar land, sea, and air. And information and communication networks will play a crucial role. They could be disrupted. And one of our participants made the case that in a future conflict, the side with the most accurate information is the one that's going to prevail. So our national security as well will depend on taking advantage of these revolutionary technologies while meeting the challenges posed by such technologies in the hands of our adversaries. Now, one of our conclusions is that the United States is in a better position than many other countries to succeed, to ride this wave, to take advantage of the opportunities before us. Our industries, our universities are at the forefront of innovation and the new technologies. Talented people are attracted to the United States from all over the world. Our tradition of immigration allows us to maintain the size of our workforce even as we age. Workers will need new skills for new jobs. We know how to do that. The biggest problem we see is the shortfall in K-12 education. But overall, the United States is in a better position than most to take advantage of these opportunities and to mitigate the problems. So that's what I've been doing for the 5 years since I left the State Department. As Mark said, in the 44 years that I was there, I worked mostly on nuclear issues, first with the Soviet Union, then Russia, finally Iran. When I left, I had to give a little speech. Everybody, I mean, I would have preferred to just walk out the door, but you have to give a little speech. People crowd around and so forth. In my little speech, I identified some indicators that it was time to leave. One of them was working with the children, and in fact, even the grandchildren of people I once worked with. That was an indicator, maybe it was time to move on. But another indicator it was time to leave was that I was working to extract the United States from agreements that I had once helped to negotiate. I first met George Shultz when he was Secretary of State and he wanted to learn about INF, the talks on intermediate range missiles, so he could negotiate in a more intense fashion with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. He didn't want to just read talking points. He wanted to mix it up, to argue, to debate. He wanted to know all about the missiles, and the arguments, and the people. And after the INF treaty was finished, he was equally determined to negotiate an agreement on the long-range strategic forces. And he would stop by my office to get an update on the START negotiations. And he was deeply disappointed when, despite his best efforts, the START treaty was not finished on his watch, and it carried over for Jim Baker. So that was the situation in the 1980s. 30 years later, when I began to work with George Shultz again, he continued to be keenly interested in INF and START, and he'd ask for little seminars to catch up. And as he heard more about the current situation, his immediate reaction was that these issues are so much more complicated now than they were in the 1980s. And so they are. The INF and START were bilateral treaties, first with the Soviet Union, then Russia. The United States and Russia could reach agreement on limits on their nuclear weapons, and to first order, everyone else could be neglected. Threats to our satellites and our cyber networks weren't then what they are today. Today, the situation is completely different and much more complex. After 25 years of START and New START, the United States and Russia have come down from tens of thousands of nuclear weapons to about 4,000 on each side, of which about 1,500 are ready to go on long-range missiles and bombers. While China has about a tenth that, and North Korea maybe 1%, they're both growing, and their forces need to be taken into account as well. Another big difference is that precision has revolutionized conventional conflict. The United States was first, but the others are not far behind. And with help from space on navigation, on targeting, on communications, precision conventional weapons can strike targets at long range, perhaps mobile targets as well. And this means that what goes on in space can determine the outcome of conflict on the ground. Another big difference is that in any future conflict, all sides will be actively seeking to compromise the information networks of their opponents. So the opponent doesn't have the information they're expecting, can't rely on the integrity of the information they do have, and is unsure of their ability to command their forces. So one of the consequences is that today it is widely believed that the most likely path to use of nuclear weapons is escalation of a conventional conflict, perhaps by miscalculation. So what to do? The first step is to recognize the need to start over. The bilateral progression from INF to START to New START needs to be reassessed from basic principles. The extension of New START provides 5 years in which to do just that. So going back to basics, what are the problems we wish to address? What are the objectives of a new agreement? Let me list some here. First would be to reduce the risk of escalation of a conventional conflict to nuclear use, which means not just reducing New START ceilings, it means getting into these stability questions involving INF, missile defense, and space as well. The second thing we want to provide for in a new agreement is predictability and transparency. New START has inspection procedures that should be expanded in Russia and extended to China as well. A third goal would be to reduce the cost and risks of unregulated competition. We don't want to have to do things just to match the Russians. Another goal would be to maintain support for modernization of US forces. The combination of modernization and negotiations on reductions can be a winning combination in Congress to get support for both. We want the support of our allies and partners and friends. Some of them depend on the credibility of our nuclear commitments. And finally, we want an agreement that will support nuclear nonproliferation. The basic bargain of the NPT is that most countries commit not to acquire nuclear weapons, And the 5 nuclear states commit to a goal of eventually eliminating nuclear weapons. And agreements on reductions are a good near-term way to demonstrate that we are living up to our obligation. So what do we do to achieve these objectives? The first thing to do, faced with this set of problems, would be to increase the resilience of our forces and our networks. More, smaller, distributed systems, backup systems. Those are things we can do ourselves. Now, what's the role of agreements with Russia? What can agreements do to help? And the answer is agreements can be part of the mix. We modernize, we make more resilient, and we reach agreements that limit Russia and China. They can all work together. And here would be my suggestion. And by the way, I'm not speaking for anybody but myself here. My suggestion is that we envisage 2 parallel negotiations. One would be bilateral with Russia. The United States and Russia hold 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. They would pursue bilateral negotiations similar in character to the negotiations that produced New START. They would work from New START as a baseline, but go beyond New START in a number of ways. As you know, the central New START limit is a 1550 ceiling on deployed strategic nuclear warheads. That could be lowered somewhat. And the other ceilings on missiles and launchers and so forth, those could be lowered somewhat as well. Another provision of the bilateral agreement that I would envisage that was not in New START, not in any previous agreement, would be a ceiling on all nuclear weapons, strategic, non-strategic, deployed, non-deployed. We've been concerned that New START and its predecessors did not cover non-strategic warheads, tactical warheads. Russia has been concerned about extra US warheads in storage that aren't covered by New START. The new ceiling would include both. But as I said, 2 negotiations. And if you take anything away from this conversation, it would be this. You cannot just have a bilateral agreement with Russia. I mean, that's necessary, but not sufficient. For one thing, the primary objective, the first thing we mentioned, was to reduce the risk of escalation of a conventional conflict to nuclear use. Lowering the START ceilings won't help that. To do that, we need to get into another set of issues: space, INF, precision conventional. So in addition to a bilateral US-Russia negotiation on strategic forces, there will be a separate parallel negotiation with not only Russia, but also China on INF, missile defense, precision conventional, space. These are all areas where China has capabilities. They're all areas where China has interests. So, I mean, I see no reason why, if approached properly, we could not engage with China in negotiations on that set of issues. Now, obviously, these would be complex negotiations, a combination of bilateral and multilateral negotiations among the United States, Russia, and China. The results would be a package of agreements, some bilateral, some multilateral. If you're interested in details, I've written all this up in an essay that was published in Daedalus last year, just about a year ago, April of 2020. So why don't I stop there? And I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts.
Thank you very much for those initial thoughts. We would like to make this a conversation. You've raised some important and interesting points. So anyone who would like to chime in, we'd prefer that you use the raise hand function if you'd like to speak. Otherwise, you're welcome to use the chat box. You know, 2 very large ideas, sort of the legacy of George Shultz and your work, both in with the State Department and then with the book. I'd like to, if I might, just ask a little bit more about, you know, the previous administration a few years ago essentially withdrew from the Iran nuclear agreement, walked away. The Biden administration has promised to re-engage on that front and will do so. I'm just wondering, what other advice would you give President Biden and his team about dealing with Iran in these early days, given that one of your key takeaways is we're not necessarily going to be moving forward bilaterally, but how might one engage in that? in that topic.
Okay, well, proliferation of nuclear weapons is a very important subject, and Iran is one of the big problem areas. My own view is that the first and next step would be for all the participants in the JCPOA to resume full compliance with the agreement as it stands. It's easy to start negotiations. It's hard to finish them. The JCPOA actually got finished as a written text. So rather than try to negotiate something else, it's easy to think of ways to improve it. Others would think of other ways, and then you have the problem of bringing it all back together to close. So I think the goal should be to get everybody back in the JCPOA, which has another 6 or 8 years before as it is, and some of the key provisions last till 2030. So that will provide a period of time in which for the situation to evolve, for people to work together and maybe work on some successor arrangement and something bigger. Now, actually the Europeans, the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, the Biden administration have all said something similar to what I just said. It's going to be tricky. Most of what the Iranians have done is reversible. Everything the Americans have done, all the sanctions, that's all reversible. There's a difference between most and everything. They've done a few things in R&D, which they would not be allowed to do under the agreement. It's hard to undo R&D, so there's a bit of work to be done there. You have to be careful that there's a review procedure, a congressional review procedure, which the JCPOA as drafted has gone through. If you make any change at all, then arguably it needs to go back through this congressional review and so forth. So it can all get very complicated very quickly. There's also the sequencing issue. The way the JCPOA was brought into force was that the Iranians did everything they needed to do. That was verified by the IAEA, and then we did the things that we needed to do. I thought we're somewhat clever in making those two things simultaneous, taking advantage of the rotation of the Earth, that there was a certain day in January 2016 where that morning the IAEA put out a report saying that Iran had done all the things they were supposed to do. And we had time to read that and so forth. So that afternoon in Washington, which was like 10 hours later, we were able to start the process of lifting the sanctions. I think something like that could be done again. Pick a day and say, and by that date, Iran will be back in compliance. By that date, we will do everything. I guess the one last thing to say is that everything the Trump administration did is not going to be quickly forgotten around the world. And just to give one example of that, Iran gave up all of its, or all but 300 kilograms of its enriched uranium stockpile. And the way that was done was the Russians sent a ship, was all loaded on the ship, and the ship took it away to Russia. And then since that time, Russia has been subject to sanctions for doing that. So their enthusiasm for doing it again is going to be limited unless they can somehow be reassured, which is going to be hard to do because who knows what's going to be the situation. This is not without risks for everybody concerned, but there are benefits for everybody concerned, and especially for us. To prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons, hold them to their NPT commitments. That's a big deal for us, big deal for a lot of people. So worth the risk. There are people in the Biden administration who know all about this, starting with Jake Sullivan. I mean, he was with us in Oman. He's, so we'll see how it goes. It's not going to be easy. And another problem is that the new administration has, I mean, I think they think that Iran is a high priority, but they have lots of other high priority things to do. So, including reestablishing a relationship with allies. I mean, allies is, as we dwell on in the book, it's one thing George Shultz felt very strongly. They're a huge asset, and so we're going to be working with them. Pandemic, economics. There's a lot of very high priorities for the administration. It's not going to be easy, but there is I think a path there.
Well, and speaking about allies, we did get a good question from Tom Simons, I believe. Where would the British and the French nuclear forces figure in those dual track negotiations?
Well, that's a good question. The British and the French aren't much of a problem for anybody. I mean, the British have cut their nuclear weapons to a couple hundred, and they've said they're not going to make any more. The French, I think, are down around 300, and they're not going to make any more. So I don't think there's much more to extract from them than that for a long, long time. I think the way they might come in, though, is, I mean, you do need to deal with the Chinese. There's no doubt about it. I mean, you can't reduce below New START levels in a significant way without dealing with missile defense, INF. I mean, you can't imagine a New START agreement without something on INF. You're going to have to do something on missile defense. You have to do something on space. Our biggest stability problems involve space. So there's a big interrelationship between the strategic forces we negotiate with the Russians on, and these issues that you need to deal with the Chinese on. So maybe the Chinese will realize that, and we can have bilateral and trilateral discussions with the Chinese, but maybe not. And if that doesn't work, the next thing to try is to approach the Chinese about, well, why don't we talk about some of these issues as the P5, as the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, of the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states. There are, in the past, there have been issues that the Chinese were prepared to address in that context and not in a bilateral context. So you might be forced to deal with China in a P5 context, in which case you have the British and the French, which would be, from my point of view, a complication. But if you increase the number of parties to a negotiation from 3 to 5, that doesn't make it simpler. They bring their own views and issues. We saw that in the JCPOA. But so there are. I don't think there's much work to be done on the British and French forces. They're already sort of at a minimum deterrent level. When you get everybody else down to a minimum deterrent level, then you can talk to them, about going below that. But, so I don't think there's much work to be done with the British and French, but they could, for other reasons, you could easily see scenarios where they would be involved.
Thank you.
Does that answer Tom's question? Tom and I go back a long ways.
Sure does. No, it's very, very helpful. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, we did have another good question. William Courtney points out, in nuclear arms control, obtaining the Senate's advice and consent to treaties has helped give them enduring relevance. The JCPOA and the Paris Climate Agreement did not receive advice and consent, and the U.S. reputation for reliability has suffered. So his question is, should the United States constrain itself to negotiating accords which can gain wider domestic support? What are your thoughts?
Okay, Bill Courtney and I also go back a long ways, and that's a very good and, to my mind, a complex question. I don't see much prospect for the Senate consenting to ratify treaties generally. We have the Law of the Sea Treaty up there. The U.S. Navy favors ratification of the Law of the Sea Treaty, and it's not happening. There's the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I think there's more than 190 parties to that convention. I think there's one country that has signed but not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That's us. There's the Convention on the Rights of the Disabled, which again has been, I think it has 180 something parties, but not us. I just don't see the Senate ratifying treaties. I could be wrong, B, that could change. So my suggestion would be to start the negotiations kind of agnostic as to what the final form of the agreement. You'd have choices. I mean, the bilateral agreement that I envisage could be a treaty, but you wouldn't. I mean, you wouldn't do that unless you thought that there was some chance of ratification, and you'd sort of try to, as the negotiation came to the final months and weeks, you'd make a determination whether a 2/3 majority was possible. If a majority in the House and Senate, but not a 2/3 of the Senate was possible, you could have a congressional administration agreement, like the SALT I interim agreement was, like all, that's the standard format for trade treaties. So that's a possibility where you have congressional support, domestic support, but not a treaty. You may find that even that is problematic, in which case you have the option of doing it as political commitments, as the JCPOA was. I would make one last comment, and that is, I often hear, and there's a certain logic, that a treaty, because it's ratified and has obviously domestic support, that treaties are more resilient than other forms of agreement like political commitments. I point out, I don't see a lot of empirical evidence for that. I mean, it sounds right, but I don't see empirical evidence for that. The ABM treaty wasn't all that resilient. The INF treaty was not all that resilient. The JCPOA, on the other hand, I mean, the US walked away, and 2 years, 3 years later, there's still some remedy. You can still talking about going back into the JCPOA in a way you can't talk about going back into INF or ABM, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens on open skies, whether one could go back. So I simply point out to Bill and others that the proposition that treaties are resilient and other forms of agreement aren't. I don't see a lot of experimental evidence for that hypothesis.
Well, John Ordway had a question about a different proposal, and he's wondering, what do you think of Rose Scott-Muller's proposal for an INF agreement that covers nuclear weapons only?
Well, if you look at my Daedalus article, my suggestion on INF is to separate nuclear and conventional, have two separate arrangements. The INF treaty treated them together, and obviously that has verification advantages. But given the facts on the ground, I think it makes a lot of sense to do one thing on nuclear and another thing on conventional, and that's completely consistent with Rose's approach. Now on nuclear, China has a few. Russia has the 9M729, which there may be some nuclear variants there. We don't have any. So given that situation, you can easily see the possibility of just banning nuclear INF. Now, I'm not sure China would agree to that. I'm not sure Russia would agree to that, but that would be the thing you'd start out with. If that didn't work, then maybe you could have a a small number of nuclear INF, and maybe they'd be regionally, in central Russia, central China, regionally restricted for us as well. Conventional, there the facts are different, and that's the reason you separate them. China has over 1,000 conventional. We have none. Russia maybe somewhere in between. Given that disparity, one way to go about it is to have deal with conventional ones in a European, have a sort of regional, regional INF, maybe none, or for conventional, maybe none, or numbers or something. Then in Eastern Russia, China, and the Pacific, you have another number for conventional INF, and work that out with the Russians, Chinese, and ourselves. I think there's a lot of overlap between that and Rose is also a Stanford colleague, as you know. So we yes, we're good. Rose and I continue to be colleagues.
You have that connection. So a question a little bit less technical in nature. I wanted to go back to initially in the conversation you mentioned your work with former Secretary Shultz on the book, and for other FSOs and other diplomats. That's right. So others who may not have as deep of experience in the department, but do know many FSO colleagues fondly remember Secretary Shultz as one of the best secretaries of state we've ever had. And ADST helped put together a kind of a remembrance video, and online one of our moments in diplomatic history notes that he put a real value on trust and the practice of diplomacy. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts about why do you think that what helped make him so well liked within the building? What do you think helped make him successful as a Secretary of State? Just personal recollections that you'd like to share. And just to point out, we would welcome these kinds of thoughts and recollections from participants on this call too. If you'd like to say something, just use the raise hand or the chat box to let us know. So I'd be curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing from others on this question as well. I certainly agree. I mean, when you say one of the best, okay, well, I think 100% of people in the State Department will say Shultz is one of the best. So we'll leave it at that. One of the things he did extraordinarily well was use the expertise of the State Department for in everything that he did. He didn't separate himself from everybody else in a little sort of cluster on the 8th floor or the 7th floor. You see how long it's been since I was there. So I think, I think certainly and I think everybody in the State Department thought that we were sort of working for George Shultz, that he was somehow benefiting from what we were doing. Not all secretaries convey that feeling to everybody, but he surely did. And I from working with him later, I see that every time he approaches somebody, he thinks, what can I learn from this person? And so, and as far as trust is concerned, yeah, he had this phrase, trust is the coin of the realm. And he would tell his Marine story, where when he was in boot camp and he was handed this M1 rifle, and he was told this take good care of this rifle, it's your best friend. Don't aim at anybody unless you're prepared to pull the trigger. No empty threats. And he believed that very strongly. That don't say something you're not prepared to back up. And if you do say you're going to do something, you do it. No second thoughts. And I think that. Oh, and let me say one more thing about George Shultz. He really, really understood the importance of listening. He would always, whenever, he would listen to everybody, but when you're talking to him, he would really focus in on you. He'd be intense. And in the case of the Reagan administration, he would listen to Ronald Reagan. He would listen to President Reagan. And the Washington at that time was full of people who thought their purpose was to tell the president things, teach the president things. But Shultz Schultz listened, and he was interested in what he was hearing from President Reagan about nuclear weapons, about the Soviet Union, about Gorbachev, and so forth. And that was a huge strength, that he that he would know, he would learn things, and he would know about where people stood just by listening. It seems obvious, but you'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised, how little listening goes on, how much talking and how little listening. It's so you can't listen while you're talking. And that's another phrase of his. You don't learn anything when you're talking. So
that's a good point. That's a good point.
Yeah, well, he has a lot of good points, and you can see that.
Absolutely. Well, we have Frank Wisner and then Tom. We'll start with Frank.
These are all my friends here.
Yes.
Friends and admirers, Jim, thank you for everything you've done today, and of course for the many years that we've all been associated with you. But there is one subject you didn't touch on today. I want to ask you to talk for a second about North Korea. Over many decades, we have insisted on the full denuclearization of North Korea as the bedrock of American policy. And many argue today more sanctions and more pressure will produce a different outcome. What do you think? What's the best way to approach the Korean nuclear problem?
Well, you noticed in my sort of introduction of things I've worked on, I did not mention North Korea. So I come at North Korea as an amateur, but I think step by step is a reasonable way to approach any really difficult problem. When there's in the strategic area, the analog of denuclearization is the ban treaty, and I think I much prefer step by step rather than jumping in the end. So I think I think we ought to. I think this notion of patience is somehow, that doesn't sound like the right way to go. If I were to approach North Korea, first of all, I would work very closely with the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Russians, the others in the neighborhood. Try to take advantage of the fact that North Korea is isolated, and that there's a certain common view of the people of the countries around them. I would focus. I would say my my most urgent objective would be no more tests, no more explosive tests. The number two would be no more production of fissile material, but maybe try to do, first one, then the next. Delivery systems, I would save for later, maybe third, or because it's so hard. For nuclear testing, you have the advantage that nobody's doing it. There's a global norm, and North Korea is the only violator. For fissile material, again, we're not making fissile material. A few others are, but I think you're on solider ground, and also it's, testing is more irreversible than other things. So I think if we had a sequence of objectives and worked hard to get the first one, the no testing. But by the way, I give a little bit of credit to the Trump administration on the nuclear testing. I mean, the situation the Trump administration inherited on North Korea was not good. As you remember, there was sort of a pause or quiet period for the Olympics, but I think the expectation of everybody was that after the Olympics was over, the North Koreans would carry out another test, shoot some more missiles, and so forth. That hasn't happened. So I think the situation did not deteriorate over those 4 years, but it could easily, all these things could happen tomorrow. Be another nuclear test, an ICBM test. So, but I think a big effort with a sequence of goals, and do it with in partnership with others around there. That would be my suggestion. But an amateur one. I have no experience in this. And it's nice to see you.
Okay, John, you.
Yeah, I want Jim to get to Bob Einhorn's question, but I have just a Shultz story. Christmas of 1982, State Department offices have Christmas parties, and SOV was the largest bilateral desk in the department, so we had a big party. And I smuggled a whole bunch of caviar out of Moscow via the Bolivian people in our canteen. And there was vodka and there was a lot of cigarette smoke. So it was a very Russian kind of atmosphere. And working on Soviet affairs was not the flavor of the month in December 1982, but suddenly we were told that the secretary was going to come down and join us. And he came down and waded into this Russian party with the smoke and the vodka and the caviar, and he stayed for about half an hour. And I would lead people, the courageous ones, up to him. It had taken me 9 years to be with the Secretary of State, so it took a little courage. But at the end of it, I was just elated. And I knew that his peers were Johnny Agnelli and Lee Kuan Yew and Giscard d'Estaing. It wasn't us in SOV, but he sure did know how to build a team. Thank you.
He did know how to build a team, and he built a very good team with the State Department, but he also built a team around him. I mean, he wound up with Colin Powell at the White House and Frank Carlucci in the Defense Department and him in the State Department, which is the best team at that level, you're ever likely to see again. So yes, he favored team building as a sport.
Read Bob's question. Read Bob's question.
We do have a good one. I've got it here. Bob Einhorn asks a good one. Are we at the end of the road on nuclear reductions? President Obama wanted to reduce New START levels by 1/3, but the Russians refused in the absence of constraints on US missile defenses and long-range conventional missiles. But if the US remains unwilling to limit missile defenses, and given the complexities of cyber and the third countries that you mentioned, are there any prospects of moving closer to a world without nuclear weapons?
Well, okay. I would take them as two separate questions. One is, can you reduce from New START? And second, what about a world without nuclear weapons, which is another step. I think it's definitely possible to come down from the New START levels, 20%, 15, 25, something, significant, but not dramatic. I agree with Bob that it can't be done without addressing missile defense, INF, space. But I think we should address those issues. I think we should address those issues, not just to get the Russians to agree to come down. We should address them because they're closely interrelated to the strategic forces. So I mean, I think we probably, I mean, Bob has a point here that one possibility is to sort of stay at the 1,500 New START level indefinitely. I think that would have negative implications for a lot of things, including non-proliferation. But I think a serious effort to come down 20%, come down to 1,200, 1,000, something like that. That would require, and in addition to that, we should, another objective should be to limit Russian non-strategic and maybe get rid of some of those. And so that's going to take work. It's going to require, some of those issues need to be negotiated with the Chinese as well as the Russians. It's going to take work. It would not be easy, but I think that's definitely doable given some priority. It won't be just taking the New START framework and lowering it by 1/3. That, as Bob says, that didn't get anywhere. You need to deal with it in a bigger context, dealing with these other issues, which can be done. I mean, I said in my article that one significant thing you can do on missile defense is to prohibit space-based missile defense interceptors, which I think that's something we haven't done, but the Russians have expressed concern about. And I think we don't want the Chinese to do that either, let alone the Russians. So there are things we can do on missile defense. There are things we can do on INF and so forth. So I think we can do those things, bring down New START. As far as getting rid of nuclear weapons altogether, again, I think you have to move in steps. I would take the first step or two without worrying too much about what the last step is going to look like. I think the idea of the ban treaty is not the answer. I admire the energy, particularly the energy of the young people who inspired the ban treaty and did it. But a treaty eliminating nuclear weapons without the participation of any of the holders of nuclear weapons, it's hard to see how that's the right next step. But it'd be good to find ways to sort of capture or channel that enthusiasm and that energy and that young spirit.
Well, thank you. I mean, I understand, Jim, you're going to have to drop off very soon. So I just wanted to say, on behalf of ADST and all of us, really, I want to thank you again for a wonderful discussion. I think we raised some important points, and we can certainly keep going. I just want to encourage everyone to visit adst.org, subscribe to our weekly newsletter, and recommend ADST to friends, colleagues, or anyone, anywhere who's hungry for a monthly dose of discussion about U.S. diplomatic history. It's been inspiring to see the steady growth in the turnout for these kinds of discussions. And finally, I just want to say, please remember ADST is a private nonprofit organization. We rely on the generosity of our supporters across the country who are inspired by our nonpartisan mission of capturing, preserving, and sharing the experiences of U.S. diplomats. If you're joining us for the first time, it would be so great if you would signal your support for our mission by becoming a member or giving a donation in any amount as an expression of enthusiasm and support for our work, including this discussion series. So we look forward to your participation at other events. Thank you again, Jim.
Thank you for inviting my friends.
We appreciate it.
Okay, I've enjoyed it.
Thanks so much.